Here's Jimbob to misunderstand how science works.
Okay, scientific theory is a likely explanation of what causes an observable natural phenomenon based on an experiment using the scientific method. The scientific method goes as follows. Observation, question is what causes Y phenomenon. Hypothesis is I think X causes Y phenomenon. Experiment, introduce X, remove X, repeat, draw a conclusion, and develop a scientific theory at the tail end of that process. The only arbiter for two competing hypotheses in natural science is an experiment.
That's a pretty good summary of the scientific method, except for Jimbob's description of how experiments work. He seems to think that the only way to do an experiment is to introduce X, remove X, repeat. He thinks that experiments require a manipulable variable. They don't. Another way you can do an experiment is by inferring what consequences would result in a given circumstance if a theory or hypothesis were true, and then simply looking at whether those consequences do in fact manifest in that particular scenario. Take, for example, the Eddington experiment, which was an early test of general relativity. Arthur Eddington said that if general relativity is true, then we should be able to see gravitational lensing around the sun during an eclipse. He looked for gravitational lensing during an eclipse, and he found it. This is a perfectly legitimate way of doing science that doesn't involve the manipulation of a single variable.
You have to start with the observation, not tie an observation to your assumed theory. This is not science, this is pseudoscience. So again, if you're going to claim that you found fossils, is there something specific about the fossils you're calling your observation?
Yeah, the characteristics of the fossils. So, for example, Archaeopteryx was predicted to have existed before its fossil was ever found. It should have intermediate traits between theropod dinosaurs and birds, and it does.
Okay, hold on. Again, you're telling a story about the observation. In science, you start with an observation, just purely, and describe it, okay? So what are you purely observing with fossils, please? Very clearly.
In this particular example, we're observing that birds and theropod dinosaurs share a lot of traits in common. The proposed explanation is that birds descended from theropods. A way to test that is to predict that we should find intermediary fossils that share traits of both modern birds and theropods. The fact that such a fossil was found corroborates the idea that birds descended from theropods.
I'm just saying, in clear language, you're discovering a fossil and you're looking at its anatomy and you're comparing it to modern anatomy, right? In short, that's your observation.
Yes, because what evolution tells us is that the organisms of today are the descendants of organisms of the past.
Stop going to the theory. I'm asking. Stop it.
I'm telling you the scientific steps.
You can't interpret the observation with the theory because the theory is at the tail end of the theory. You have to pretend you don't know what the theory is.
No, you don't. Arthur Eddington started with the idea of general relativity, inferred a consequence of that idea, then tested it by looking at whether that consequence actually exists. Jimbob doesn't seem to understand that this is a perfectly legitimate way to carry out the scientific method. The discovery of the Archaeopteryx is perfectly analogous to this approach.
I'm talking, Archaeopteryx was discovered only a few years after On the Origin of Species was published.
I don't care about the story.
Evolution was very much hypothetical at the time, and I'm telling you what happened when it was very hypothetical. Before genetics, before the modern synthesis, before any of that
stuff. Stop your story. Stop the filibustering storytelling.
Jimbob doesn't seem to understand that the discovery of the Archaeopteryx is one of the scientific observations that elevated evolution from a hypothesis to a theory.
I don't care about your stories. Observation. There is a fossil that has an anatomy. There is a current animal today that has similar anatomy, right? All I'm asking you is that the observation?
That's one of the observations, yeah.
Okay, let's start with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was really hard. Observation. Old thing has traits, typical traits, anatomy. Current thing has similar things, right? The next question in the scientific method is, what causes the similarity, right? That's your question?
Yeah, and the hypothesis is that the similarity is caused by birds descending from theropods.
I never asked a question. What are you talking about?
I know, because you didn't do the scientific method. Thank you. So the next question in the scientific method, Peterson, is you start with the observation, and now you're asking a question about the observation in nature, the similarities between these two things. So isn't the question what causes the similarities between these things?
Yeah, and then that would be genetics, which was discovered farther down the road.
Hold on a second.
What is going
If the
on?
question is what causes this phenomenon you call similarity in traits or anatomy, right? Your hypothesis is now this. What causes similarity, correct?
A hypothesis is not a question.
Yeah, the hypothesis is that similarity is caused by descent.
I didn't say it was. We
Yes,
already
you
asked
did.
the
You said your
question.
hypothesis is what causes similarity.
Dude, are you holy shit? Your
That's what you
observation
said.
Dude, the hypothesis is the question is what causes this phenomenon, right? The hypothesis is positing X causes Y, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what is X in this scientific method? We got to the observation, we asked the question, what causes the similarities, right? You have fossils, and that's your observation, right? A fossil and the current bird that you're referring to. Hypothesis is X causes Y. So what is X?
X is that birds descended from theropods. A way of testing that is by looking in an intermediary fossil layer for a fossil that shares traits of both theropods and modern birds. Jimbob refuses to acknowledge that this is a legitimate way to test this hypothesis because it doesn't involve a manipulable variable.
You could say common descent. You could also say genetics.
Question big.
No, it's
Isn't
not.
common descent to the theory itself?
In this particular case, it's just a hypothesis inferred from the theory. Evolution says that all organisms have a common ancestor, but that doesn't mean that everything descended from everything else. It could have turned out to be the case that evolution is correct, but that theropods were merely cousins of modern birds rather than their ancestors. It could have turned out to be the case that birds and theropods have similar traits because theropods have a common ancestor with birds rather than being the ancestors of birds. Since that's the case, the idea that birds descended from theropods is not question-begging.
It's an implication of the theory, yes, but we would look at.
So you can't.
We would look at any.
Stop.
Go ahead.
Common descent is a post-diction, basically story of what is occurring. We're asking for something that's X that you could introduce to produce similarities between these two things, right?
No, you don't have to introduce anything. Experiments with manipulable variables are great, but they're not the only way to test a hypothesis or theory.
The phenomenon is similarities in phenotype, right? So now we're asking the question, what causes similarities in phenotype? And you've skipped to common descent, which you can't introduce into an experiment. You can't introduce common descent and remove it.
Nor do you need to. Just as Arthur Eddington didn't need to introduce relativity into the universe and then remove it in order to do his experiment, you don't need to introduce common descent and remove it in order to test whether it occurred.
This is not science.
What? We do evolutionary. We do evolutionary experiments all the time.
I didn't ask if you think we do evolutionary experiments.
I don't think
experiments
we
all the
do.
time.
We do.
I'm trying to. I don't care what you think we do right now.
I
We're
don't think
doing
that
one
we
observation.
do. We do.
Jimbob might have an easier time believing that there are experiments testing evolution if he understood what an experiment is. Here's Ken Miller to explain an experiment that tested and corroborated the theory of evolution.
You all know that evolution argues that we share a common ancestor with the great apes, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the orangutan. Well, if that's true, there should be genetic similarities, and in fact there are. But there's something that's really interesting and has the potential, if it were true, to contradict evolutionary common ancestry. And that is, we have 2 fewer chromosomes than the other great apes. We have 46, they all have 48. That's very interesting. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, first of all, the 46 chromosomes that we have, you got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. So it's actually 23 pairs. These guys have 24 from each parent, so they have 24 pairs. So everybody in this room is missing a pair of chromosomes. Now, where'd it go? Could it have gotten lost in our lineage? If it got lost, if a whole primate chromosome was lost, that would be lethal. So there's only 2 possibilities. And that is, if these guys really share a common ancestor, that ancestor either had 48 chromosomes or 46. Now, if it had 48, 24 pairs, which is probably true, because 3 out of 4 have 48 chromosomes, what must have happened is that 1 pair of chromosomes must have gotten fused. So we should be able to look at our genome and discover that 1 of our chromosomes resulted from the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes. So we should be able to look around our genome. And you know what? If we don't find it, evolution is wrong. We don't share a common ancestor. So how would we find it? Well, biologists in the room will know that chromosomes have nifty little markers. They have markers called centromeres, which are DNA sequences that are used to separate them during mitosis, and they have cool little DNA sequences on the end called telomeres. What would happen if a pair of chromosomes got fused? Well, what would happen is the fusion would put telomeres where they don't belong, in the center of the chromosome, and the resulting fused chromosome should actually have two centromeres. One of them might become inactivated, but nonetheless it should still be there. So we can scan our genome, and you know what? If we don't find that chromosome, evolution's in trouble. Well, guess what? It's chromosome number 2. Our chromosome number 2 was formed by the fusion of two primate chromosomes. This is the paper from Nature a little more than a year ago.
In Jimbob's mind, this doesn't count as science for some reason. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.